So Israel just released the results of their investigation into the ambulance attack in Gaza a couple weeks ago. Bottom line up front, they say that the examination determined that 2 of the 3 incidents that we're going to get into here resulted from an operational misunderstanding by the troops, essentially the fog of war, whereas the 3rd involved a breach of orders. That 3rd led to the removal of 1 senior officer from the IDF, which at this point, from my understanding, is the only repercussion coming out of this event. Now, to go back a little bit here, this attack took place on March 23rd, and the controversy was that shortly after Israel released their series of events saying there were no flashing lights and these vehicles approached in an aggressive manner and posed a threat, the New York Times released a video, some of which will play in today's video, showing that very clearly these were ambulances with lights blaring. The explanation as to what happened is here in the Israeli version of events. If we get another explanation, another investigation, we'll be sure to report that as well. But they say, quote, "The findings show that the incident occurred in a hostile and dangerous combat zone under a widespread threat to the operating troops. The backdrop of the incident is that the challenge and responsibility of the IDF to respect and protect medical teams and facilities carrying out their duties while also confronting Hamas's repeated use of such infrastructure for terrorism, including using ambulances to transport terrorists and weapons." They say the examination found no evidence to support claims of execution or that any of the deceased were bound before or after the shooting. It's notable that they call that out early on in this reporting before even walking through the 3 incidents here. But getting into the 3 events, they say on the night of the incident, March 23rd, 2025, the troops were conducting a vital mission aimed at targeting terrorists. Throughout the operation, vehicles and ambulances moved along the route without obstruction, since the forces do not perceive any threat posed by them. The forces also apprehended 2 pedestrians who raised suspicion and released them subsequently. This indicates that the troops did not engage in indiscriminate fire, but remained alert to respond to real threats identified by them. And this is something that Tal mentioned in a video we talked about last week, this disconnect of, was the IDF out there just shooting anything that moved, but at the same time also, detaining, questioning, and then releasing other people. Also in the middle of this firefight, they let people go at the end of it. So it was just confusing start to finish. But they say there were 3 shooting incidents that day, and really 2 of these are what caught international attention. First, and this one not really being all that reported, but I think is important to kind of set the stage for what played out here. They say the first incident, the troops fired at a vehicle identified as a Hamas vehicle. Following this, the troops remained on high alert for further potential threats. And that, I think, puts you in that mindset, right? They were on scene. They say that this vehicle was transporting Hamas fighters. That's the IDF claim. So following that incident, we move into the second and then the third. They say the second incident, approximately 1 hour later, the troops opened fire on suspects emerging from fire truck and ambulances very close to the area in which the troops are operating, after perceiving an immediate and tangible threat. Supporting surveillance had reported 5 vehicles approaching rapidly and stopping near the troops, with passengers quickly disembarking. The deputy battalion commander assessed the vehicles as employed by Hamas forces who arrived to assist the first vehicle's passengers. Under this impression and sense of threat, he ordered them to open fire. 15 Palestinians were killed, 6 of whom were identified in a retrospective examination as Hamas terrorists. Due to poor night visibility, the deputy commander did not initially recognize the vehicles as ambulances. Only later, after approaching the vehicles and scanning them, was it discovered that these were indeed rescue teams. That's the meat and potatoes of all of this, and I'm not convinced that it really clarifies all that much of anything. We've got the video. We'll play some more clips here. Night vision or not, there's flashing lights on these things. So if anybody in that IDF formation did not have their night vision or thermal devices that they were looking through, they would see the red lights, which should at the very least, raise a little bit of suspicion. Should we interrogate this a little bit further before opening fire? And this isn't talking about a bomb being dropped or a missile being fired or an artillery strike. You're talking about small arms fire. At small arms range, you're identifying whether or not those people have weapons. It's not as easy under night vision devices. It's harder. Little easier under thermals, but nonetheless, if you can accurately engage and eliminate 15 people at relatively close range, I don't know the distance at this point, you should be able to tell whether or not they have weapons or not, or at least across the entire formation. So that's something that doesn't really answer the question. It seems like, if nothing else, the order to fire here was given rather prematurely, to say the least. Now, moving on to the third incident, they say about 15 minutes later, the troops fired at a Palestinian UN vehicle due to operational errors and breach of regulations. The troops' commander initially reported the event, and additional details emerged after the examination. Now, something I struggle with in this and any conflict that we're reporting on is trying to armchair quarterback the situation for the troops on the ground, because it's impossible to understand what's going through their mind at the moment where they're pulling the trigger. Just you can't do it. The real-time stressors, I mean, to include the little things of how much sleep did they get the night before, how long have they been on this operation, what is the history of this unit and their chain of command and the history of fighting in this area, new and experienced troops, all of that. There's so much that comes together, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's the obligation when you're using lethal force like this, it's an obligation to ensure that it's being used in an ethical and legal manner. So that mistakes happen. And people need to be held accountable for those mistakes. We're going to get to the accountability here in a moment. I think we're probably going to have some mixed reactions on it. They say the examination determined that the fire in the first two incidents resulted from an operational misunderstanding by the troops, who believed they faced a tangible threat from enemy forces. The third incident involved a breach of orders during a combat setting. So it sounds like in that third case, they were not supposed to fire at all, maybe, or they were told not to fire and they opened fire anyways. And that's the UN vehicle here. Now, in terms of the repercussions that are coming out, there's one piece I wanted to make sure we talk to here. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip over this. I'm going to link this entire article or this statement in the description below so you can read it start to finish if you want. There's a lot of things I'm moving past, not because, well, honestly, I don't know that they're as important to the overall assessment here, but some fluff in and around that I think is not necessarily adding to the overall incident. But they say at dawn, because this was an important factor that I saw mentioned a couple times, understandably so. They say at dawn, it was decided to gather and cover the bodies to prevent further harm and clear the vehicles from the route in preparation for civilian evacuation. The body removal and vehicle crushing were carried out by field commanders. The examination concluded that removing the bodies was reasonable under the circumstances, but the decision to crush the vehicles was wrong. In general, there was no attempt to conceal the event, which was discussed with international organizations and the UN, including coordination for the removal of bodies. And this is another one where, honestly, I'm coming at it from a couple different angles. One, I'm glad they clarified the point that burying bodies in Gaza, kind of a short-term burial site, is something that has been done throughout this conflict to prevent dogs. And, you don't want rotting bodies sitting out if you can avoid it. So it's like a nasty side of war, but it is something that's being done throughout this conflict, and it's not meant as a sign of disrespect. That I think initially this was viewed as. I heard people say, "Oh, mass grave, that must mean that it was executions and they were hidden." But no, this is standard operating procedure and has been throughout the conflict. The crushing of the vehicles was a little suspect, especially when one of the vehicles that we saw crushed, and I'll put up the picture here, had clear UN markings. Seems like that probably should have drawn a little bit of concern, raised some alarm bells. But the bigger piece here that I'm kind of hung up on is they're saying they went up to the location where the fight took place, identified the bodies, and then buried them. It seems like if there were weapons on site or RPGs or IEDs or anything, that's the kind of thing that we would have a lot of evidence of. They would clearly show, like, oh yeah, there were even if there was one AK amongst these 15 people, it seems like that would have been brought to our attention. We'd have pictures of that, or at the very least it would be mentioned, but it wasn't even mentioned at the time or now. So that still feels a little strange. Like at the time that they're actively burying the bodies, they're still coming forward and saying these were Hamas, and kind of nothing about the ambulances and fire truck. That still doesn't quite sit right. In terms of the repercussions here, they say the commanding officer of the 14th Brigade will receive a reprimand, which will be recorded in his personnel file for his overall responsibility for the incident, including the procedure of combat and management of the scene afterwards. The deputy commander of the Golani Reconnaissance Battalion will be dismissed from his position due to his responsibilities as the field commander in this incident and for providing an incomplete and inaccurate report during the debrief. Existing protocols have been clarified and reinforced, emphasizing the need for heightened caution when operating near rescue forces and medical personnel, even in high-intensity combat zones. So really what we're getting out of this is Israel recognizing that rescue workers, civilians, aid workers were killed, unintentionally so, and the fallout appears to be one person is going to lose their job. And that's the other thing I was starting to get into a minute ago, in that nobody's ever going to be fully happy, if you will, with what comes out of these investigations in any conflict. That's nothing new, and it's not unique to this one. You can look at the war in Ukraine. You can go back throughout history in any conflict even when somebody is shown to have done something wrong. I mean, let's go to World War II, right? For all of the wrongs done by Nazi Germany, we saw a few people at the Nuremberg trials, right? It didn't okay, that was something. I don't think anybody around the world really feels like full justice was done. And it tends to be the same when we're talking about down to the individual level like this, right? We've seen cases in the United States where we have outright war criminals that have murdered civilians overseas, and they're in jail. Some get released from jail. It doesn't feel like but how do you do a 1-for-1 like that without, quite frankly, capital punishment, like killing the person? And then even then, does it line up? And so I expect that people are not going to be happy with the results of the Israeli investigation, even though it does look like they at least accepted responsibility from what I can see at this point. Nonetheless, tragic. Any loss of life is tragic. So I'm going to link this, of course, in the description below if you want to check it out further. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.